Hey everybody, welcome back. For this week, our second lecture, you can see that I've switched situations for myself, and we are now seated in front of a large window because we are dealing with notions of positionality and place. And I feel like sitting in front of that wall of works um, was a nice way to start, but given that the course of today's conversation is going to be talking about bringing kind of exterior ideas into conversation, sitting by a window seemed to make the most amount of sense. So, um, or at least that's kind of the direction that we're going in. So, again, this lecture is going to be pretty brief. We are going to be talking about the writings that I assigned from Grant Kester, although we're not going to be talking that much about him. We're going to be talking much more about Foucault, Raymond Williams, and their understandings of author and also of the way that culture is structured. Now, I'm also going to tip into, um, sorry, I'm also going to tip into the readings for next week. It's come to my attention that a few of you feel as though these are overwhelming, and that makes incredible amount of sense. Um, and I know that assigning these readings to have you do at your own places uh, just leads to confusion. It leads to misunderstanding, or it leads to kind of a lack of ownership over this text. You might not feel as though you got everything out of it. You might have been confused by it, and so I want to talk to you about Sherry Ortner's writing, about Anne Marsh, and about Valerie Solanas. And those are the three readings that you're going to be doing into next week. And I'm going to be doing that for the remainder of the term. I'm going to be kind of bringing up the readings that you're going to be doing for the week. Do not let that be cause or reason to not do the readings. All of these readings that I've assigned are, I think, really instrumental in giving artists a sense of how culture is shaped. That's why I'm not just assigning you art history text. I'm not just assigning you art text. I started off with Gayatri Spivak, who is writing in comparative literature. She is talking in that paper directly to Michel Foucault, who I assign you. Raymond Williams is a Marxist theorist. So this course is meant to get you to access a variety, a much bigger realm of information. And in doing that, I want to make sure that you're understanding it and that you're comfortable with it. And so we're going to be looking at all of that reading. And interestingly, it all hinges around this word, which is going to be somewhere around my head, probably that way, I think. Yeah. For years, I've been saying hegemony because it just seems to make sense, but it's actually hegemony. The accent's in a different spot. So, hegemony. So, what is hegemony? Some of you might know this word. Some of you might not know this word. This word, I think, is one of the biggest terms that is dealt with by Holmes here, Michel Foucault. Michel is one of my faves. Gotta say that. Throw that out there. I gravitated towards his work. His first writing that I encountered was The History of Sexuality, Part 1, which is a fantastic book. And Foucault, Williams, is interested in the way that society is shaped. He's interested in not only the way that it's shaped, but how that shape affects the individual, right? And so here, this ridiculous, idiotic drawing, you have, not idiotic, I don't want to diminish the maker of this work, but for our purposes, it is kind of a childish drawing, right? These little things with butts running around. So here is this kind of hopeful understanding of the shape of society, that the artist can cleave himself from the masses and therefore go and do his making, or her making, generally his making, free of the shackles of bourgeois society, free of the shackles of capitalist society, and he can go off and be that expressive genius. And for Foucault, that was a little bit tricky. He saw, aptly so, that there was a kind of an access that was given to certain people within a certain culture that gave them the ability to really do what they want to do. And so it wasn't just the power, the agency, or the authority of that individual person to, as I said, walk away from the masses or separate himself from everyone else. Instead, it's a power structure. The majority of the people that resign themselves to being this kind of cultural maker or cultural participant are white men, generally from upper middle class backgrounds, generally with some sort of tie to a larger network of bourgeois money, so that he can free himself from those shackles and go and make the work that he is destined to make. And what Foucault argues in other texts, not just what is author, that text is very specific. But in other texts, he really pinpoints the fact that there are these kind of hegemonic structures that dictate the access that people have to different plateaus within the culture that they find themselves within. And so going back to Miss Spivak, you have in that text the identification that within this kind of hegemonic structure, which is of course tethered to the episteme of the moment, within the hegemonic structure of British dominance in the Indian subcontinent, you had this group of people that were so positioned that they could only access certain routes of agency. They could only go so far. And so, in this conglomeration here, and let's, this might have been a female, maybe even a female painter. And we'll just say that this is 1868 in France. So this would be, Monet. And Monet has the ability, because he's a moneyed white dude who has access to art dealers and also access to people in London and Paris, he has the ability to cleave himself and walk away from everyone. Whereas you have this person here, who may not actually have that access point. And so they might be making work that's very similar, but because of the hegemonic structure of the day, they are incapable of reaching this goal. And the same can be said for this person, the same can be said for this person, the same can be said for this person. So rather than say that, Holmes here has the ability to do all of this stuff because he's better than humanity, bullshit. What Foucault is arguing is that all of these people are as constricted or conscripted by society to perform in a certain way. This person is supposed to be a boot shiner. This person is supposed to be an indentured servant. And the kind of epistemic violence that can be tethered or extracted from these hegemonic structures is something that really, really pissed off this lady, right? So Valerie Solanas, who lived from 1936 to 1988, she is one of the readings for you to complete in the next week, and it's an excerpt from the Scum Manifesto. And what Solanas identified around the same time as Foucault, because this was not, Foucault wrote about it, but he wasn't the only person to have these thoughts, right? No one has these thoughts by themselves. No one is alone in the world. And so she kind of sees that this stuff is happening, and she sees this, what some people have described as a glass ceiling for women. Solanas would have defined more as a cage. Women, females in society are actually totally caged. They have zero access to anything. They have zero power. And all of the little niceties that culture has bestowed upon them, like the vote or the ability to buy land, for Solanas, it's not enough. And you'll read in the text that's assigned to you, the excerpt from Scum Manifesto, that she has a very specific goal. And that goal is to co-opt the power structure that has positioned the male identity as superior, and to basically destroy the male sex and replace it with a female hegemony, right? And what she's talking about is relative to this little pixelated graph that I found on the internet. Gotta love the internets, everybody. And this is the hegemonic structure of masculinity, give or take, right? So, directly hegemonic masculinity. So there's the power structure. And this is the way that the power structure remains, in Williams's term, the dominant culture. So the dominant culture has, there is a power inequality. Women do not have the ability to do X, Y, and Z. And this can, we can say that this is, let's say, 16, actually, let's erase that. And we'll just do broader. So we'll do, 17th century, so like post Magna Carta to the 20th century. Sorry, my little chicken scratch. So from the 17th century to the 20th century, we had a different shape to the hegemonic structure around masculinity, because people had rights after the Magna Carta, and I know Magna Carta is a little bit before the 17th century, but a lot bit before it. Anyway, and so during this time, you have a power inequality between the genders, and you have women that are consigned to basically having no rights, and men, white dudes, having a specific amount of rights bestowed by a sheet of paper. And what that does is it leads to a variety of different inequality systems. Women, up to a certain point, did not have access to the kind of healthcare that they needed. I would argue that we're at a point now where it's kind of awkwardly shifted, where men are more afraid of their genitals and women are more understanding of their genitals. It's just the nature of straight dudes being afraid of a lot of things. Social reproduction of patriarchy. So this is something that Williams kind of pinpoints directly when he talks about the way that dominant culture perpetuates itself. A dominant culture wants to remain dominant. It doesn't want to allow emergent cultures to upend their power dynamic, and it doesn't want residual cultures to make another swing or another volley for power. And it does this, and Williams really hits this on the head, it does this by co-opting various facets of it. And this has happened within our culture with regard to the gender difference. And so, the patriarchal society, that's pretty easy. Men own land, whatever. And then getting down to here, this idea of gendered socialization, the notion that for centuries we were trained so that men perform certain duties and women perform certain duties. And that for Selfness, that for Selfness was problematic. She wanted to see something different. She wanted to see a change in the shape of the world. And the means by doing that was through publication, was through kind of finding these emergent trends. And, in the 1960s, little magazines that were leftist-leaning, little magazines that were countercultural, little magazines that were, by Williams's account, very, very, very emergent. He does reference small publications in his text. He's talking more directly about what happened kind of in England during the Industrial Revolution. But he says here, the writings of the working class. He talks about the writings of the working class having radical properties of enabling them. The incorporation of working class writings, where the fundamental problem of emergence is clearly revealed, is the effective predominance of received literary forms. So, Selfness identifies that the way to get followers is to publish, right? That's a known form. It's almost a hegemonic structure, but it's not a power structure. It's just a form. So I'm getting a little too amped, a little too excited. Oh my God, it's 15 minutes already. Whoops. And so She decides to co-opt this and and create or engage with the emergent culture that actually probably is the best indication of what we can see as an emergent culture. If you're trying to think of an example, the women's liberation movement, the way that society has changed to embrace conversations about gender difference, the way that this structure has actually been fractured and reshaped, is an example of emergent culture as it's laid out by Williams. So this the potential for an entirely different group of people, a populace, to engage with the power structure in a successful way, in a way that doesn't demand that they diminish their position or change their position so that they can engage. Like for a lot, like in the 1980s, the power suit would be an example of like women co-opting maleness as a means of performing in a male-dominated culture, specifically corporate culture in the world. And even though there are little threads of that still remain, the fact of the matter is you can have women that embrace their femininity and also are CEOs. And so we're at this switch now, which is exciting. So that's hegemony. That is this lady. And all of that goes really kind of dancing around the ideas of this guy who is my favorite Marxist. Now, I know I said it was going to be 15 minutes, but I'm not going to be 15 minutes because I really, really, really want to talk to you about Sherry Ortner. But for that, I'm going to pause real quick. All right, so the reason why I want to talk about Sherry Ortner, I really do love that essay, is female to male, nature to culture. Oh, that's not what it says. Is female to male as nature is to culture. Excuse me. Published in 1972, this text has really pronounced Ortner as an authority in the conversation about female positionality. And in this text, which is written very much in the rhetoric of the day, you can see in the way that it's written that it's kind of a slacking from where Gayatri Spivak is encountering. It's more readable, is what I mean there. This paper, even though it was designed as an academic paper, it functions as an academic paper. It doesn't adhere to the same kind of, I think, pompous rhetorical structures that dance around academic papers. It's a little more readable, right? And so I want to look at this essay as an expression of what I think, if I was to give you my advice for how to write a master's thesis, I would say that it should be something along these lines. And that is to say that I really have enjoyed the papers. I know I'm late on giving you back notes for them. I apologize for that end, but I have some general notes before I get into the specifics, and you're all going to get emails with these specifics later today, hopefully. All of you today. Some of you will get them today. Definitely some of you might get them tomorrow morning. My apologies again. But so a few things about all of your papers. All of your papers, with a few exceptions, use the word I. Now, I is a problematic word when you deal with research papers. And so for the purposes of the remainder of our term, so for the rest of this fall semester, use I all you want. Get it out of your system. Talk about everything in the first person. This class, in getting you to understand positionality, performance, and collaboration, is really a course that's designed to access different parts of our contemporary understanding about self. How the self performs in a populace, how the self positions its body and its being against other power structures, and also how the self actually engages with the world around it. So like ontological experience embedded in all this, right? And so for this term, it's great. I. Put it everywhere. I love it. I love it. Next term, as we get into notions of value, we're going to be kind of looking much more rigorously at the Marxist structure of the world, and the way that value has changed as Marxism has become much more actually a hegemony of itself. I'm never going to pronounce that word right. I'm just, whatever, forget it. Anyway, so in the next term, you are all going to be assigned a research paper. And by next term, in those research paper, I want I out of the papers. So expel it. Just vomit up as many I's as you possibly can, so we can get it out of the way and move on. Because the thesis, you can write in the first person, but you can write without using that word. You can write without a direct reference to your body, because this research that Ortner has put together and the research you will be putting together for your thesis is not a self-expression. It's larger than the self. Your research becomes larger than the self, and that's an important thing to understand, an important thing to engage with as well. So that aside, all the I's, that's my conversation about I's and a little preview for next term. Let's talk a little bit about why I think the Ortner essay is awesome. First off, it's just on topic and on research and on presentation. I think it's perfect. But a few things to think about as you go through it next week. One of the things that you're going to see is, and I'm reading from my notes over here, is in the very beginning, the first few pages of this essay, she really sets up her understanding, her position against the history of discourse and the shape of the field that she's writing about. So some of you might be writing about, I don't know, painting in the public sphere. And so you're going to spend the beginning of your paper engaging with that field. Okay, what has been written about the field of painting in the public sphere? X, Y, Z. And then it takes a few pages, arguably, and maybe for your thesis you won't want to wait this long to get to a thesis, but it really takes Ortner until the third page of her text to really pronounce the thesis in argumentative terms. This is what my paper is going to be, and this is what I'm interested in doing. And I can't seem to find that piece of paper, even though I put a little thing next to it. Here we go, on page 20 of this book. Specifically, my thesis, she says it really out there, and she also uses I get it. My thesis is that woman is being identified with, or if you will, seems to be a symbol of something that every culture devalues, something that every culture defines as being at a lower order of existence than itself. So she sets, after defining the field and where culture is, she says, okay, this is my point, this is my directive, this is what I'm going to say. That's pretty great. Now, and that kind of sentence is I think the hardest sentence to write, because it's the sentence. So you're at a party, you're talking about your research, you're talking about all the stuff that you do, and like 45 minutes into boring someone that you're talking to, and I say that jokingly, even though I've bored a hell of a lot of people in my life. Case in point. You're going to say one sentence that's going to be your thesis. So it's like you've done so much research, you've thought about what you thought about of this research, you've thought about the way that you see the world and all this other stuff. And then you're going to get to this point of like, oh, but this is what I want to say. And so anticipate that statement is going to be really tough. And in anticipation on our end that statement is going to be really tough for you to write, we're building in a lot of thesis writing workshops, so to speak, to get you in the mindset for how this works. So, and a lot of the papers that were turned in had these thesis statements, but they showed up at varying points throughout the paper. Even though it was a short paper, some of them are at the end, some of them are at the beginning, some of them are in the middle. yeah, that kind of formal stuff we can nitpick later. Um, One of the things that Ortner does that a few of you did not do, and there are notes to this end, is a definition of the vocabulary for the argument. You know, in giving this conversation to you today, I defined hegemony. In giving the conversation uh, last week, I talked a lot about my definitions, the definitions that I work from with regard to the various terms that are set out before us. And even so far as the readings that I assigned in the first few weeks before I started doing these video lectures, all of that stuff was my attempt to get you to understand where I'm coming from and the terms that I'm using and the way that I'm employing them. Hold on. Okay. That's the sound of my dog scratching. So that's going to show up in a few of these videos. Sorry. In a paper that's longer than what I'm assigning for you this term, it's really great after or before you start dealing with the terms. Generally, after makes the most sense, giving us a very quick understanding of the plot that we're going to be following. So you can, and I mean, even narrative gives us this with notions of foreshadowing. When you're dealing with academic stuff, you really want to give people a structure. Now, at some point, you're going to have a thesis statement and an outline for how your master's thesis is going to flow. So what I suggest doing at some point in some draft is writing that thesis statement and then the next paragraph typing into paragraph form that outline. I'm going to show this by giving you this. I'm going to show this by giving you this. I'm going to show this by giving you this. This is my vocabulary. These are the terms that I'm going to be using, X, Y, Z, and then go into your argument. Once we're all caught up, once we're all on the same page, we can then move forward. And arguably, a lot of the conversations that I'm bringing up today are about getting people on the same page. You have people like Selfness who sees this as a limiting worldview. You have people like Williams who understands the limitations and possibilities of a culture that is knowingly shaped like this or also shaped like this. And as a means of affecting change or generating a new potential idea, these thinkers are trying to get people on the same page, to jive with their argument, so to speak. And so all of those things, a clear thesis statement, a definition of vocabulary, and also a plan for progress is a really, really, that's what a research paper should have, and that's what next semester I'm going to be looking for as we move more into the formalities of writing a book. Because even though they are only 7,500 words, those 7,500 words are going to be bound in these little books. So you're all going to be publishing a book before we leave. Isn't it exciting? So a few other things. What Ortner does, and this is probably the hardest thing, and so it's nice that we can kind of end with this. And there are going to be other videos for you to watch by this point, if you're 28 minutes into this conversation, you know there are other videos to watch, which I hope you all actually enjoyed yourselves as you watched Guy Debord's Society of Spectacle. If you haven't watched that, I recommend a movie night and watching it. Maybe I'll even try and do something like that at the ICA or something for those of you who are local. One of the things that Ortner does that all people have to do, and this is why people with PhDs have a tendency to be a little bit more bullheaded than other folks, is you have to stand your ground. You have to put forth a thesis that you believe is the truth, that is a perspective that you believe in, and you need to continue to present counter arguments in your writing and then prove those arguments wrong. Now you might say, but I agree with the people that I'm bringing in. Well, that's fine, but don't tell us that. Argue with them. Present your ideas. This is scholarship that has your name on it. And so it's a really important thing to understand as you move into this. Now, I'm going to probably deal a little bit more with Ortner and Ann Marsh next week, but 10 seconds left. I'm going to say goodbye. and have a good week.